ability to cope, and more stress and difficulties in trying to overcome their addictions and reintegrate into society as productive working members. It's just simply too hard to get a job when you have a criminal conviction. And we know in this country, we're not just talking about felony convictions. Even minor misdemeanor convictions can substantially hobble you in the workforce and in life, including where you can live and so forth. I won't go into restorative justice since Roger addressed that tremendously well, but that's also another area that we're seeing being implemented throughout the country to sidestep the criminal justice system. And what we have is someone that's gone astray, certainly in the criminal realm, but needs to try and salvage their future. Usually you see this in juvenile offenses, and I've also seen it be much more rewarding to victims even in serious murder cases where the victim isn't just a tool of the advocates who is constantly involved in the dredging up of and relitigation of the offense, but instead the offender and victims come together and heal and move on. The U.S. Sentencing Commission has seen the light with regard to diversion for incarceration and placement into treatment as well. Some new guidelines we expect to go into effect next month help divert offenders from incarceration and place them into treatment in a modest amendment to the sentencing guidelines. And the guidelines have been made advisory so that we can respond to individuals and provide individual sentencing based upon factors that aren't the product of some calculus where an accountant goes through the different guidelines, adds the points, and ignores the human being and the facts and circumstances surrounding the offense and the offender. Now we're seeing the Commission take testimony to establish whether or not the guidelines recognize empirical data and really truly reflect the harm to society, the culpability of the offender, and what the appropriate sentence should be, not greater than necessary to achieve the sentencing goals listed in the legislation. Probation offices have gotten in step here as well. I was delighted to meet Dick Burris, a probation officer from St. Louis, Missouri, who has taken no additional funding or resources and used what he had in his meager budget to employ what works: rehabilitation, job training, teaching employers about tax breaks for employing convicted felons, job placement, and Unicor. Originally, he employed these to stop the large number of persons who were being revoked from supervised release after having served their federal sentences. But ultimately, he determined, with the help of a strong group of defense lawyers who said they were tired of this, revolving door that was happening in St. Louis. It was, I think, the third worst jurisdiction for revocation of supervised release, and I think it's now the 66th. Because now Dick Burris and these defense lawyers employ these rehabilitation, job training, and tax breaks to employers features pre-sentencing. And Dick reports that in 50% of cases now in his jurisdiction, the probation officers are recommending variances from the guidelines. What we end up with is offenders appropriately punished, burdened with a criminal conviction, and yet able to reintegrate into society and stop coming back, recidivating, and costing us more, both in public safety and the expense of incarceration. In the report, Minor Crimes and Massive Waste, the NACDL also examined our misdemeanor courts, and this was on a state basis. And we found that so many, just like the federal government overcriminalizes walking a dog in a public building, a government building and the like, we found across the country non-criminal conduct and minor social wrongs were criminalized and just dumped into the misdemeanor courts, and it did result in massive waste. The expense for prosecuting fish and game violations when they could be fine-only offenses in the municipal courts, or driving with a license suspended unrelated to DWI, where these were collateral consequences for non-payment of child support and the like, or a minor in possession of alcohol. That just these many offenses, so many offenses were being dumped into the misdemeanor court system, feeding the homeless, people sleeping in public parks, and other nonviolent minor drug offenses, or unleashed dog in a park, sexual paraphernalia sales were being dumped into the misdemeanor courts. And so prosecutors, courts, and defense lawyers were being so tremendously overburdened that we saw a national trend of people being without counsel, despite the Supreme Court decisions requiring that, being asked to visit with the prosecutor, or you can go enter your plea in the court next door without any counseling or information. And as I mentioned before, these misdemeanor offenses carry a substantial penalties, not in the fine or the time served in jail, but in your ability to gain employment and find a place to live. And so the whole system was being short-circuited. Instead of being able to pay attention on more serious criminal wrongs, what we had was a cattle call, a process without any substance or meaningfulness. The cost and effect of this is easy to see. In the blue collar arena, we spend $30,000 a year to imprison someone, and what we get is someone who recidivates. There's no obtaining a GED, there's no job skills, there's no reentry programs available in the vast number of jurisdictions. When we know that $30,000 a year would really afford someone a wonderful college education, we could spend our resources much better than we have. Cradle to college instead of cradle to imprisonment, even with misdemeanor convictions, is a much smarter way to go. And this is true in the white-collar arena as well. Convicting a professional leads to their unemployment, their debarment, their inability to do business. Civil fines for regulatory wrongs, especially those that these regulators have just produced, the 10,000 regulations, many unrelated to any criminal statute in the United States Code. That would be sufficient to prevent recidivism, because getting a civil fine for a regulatory wrong also impacts one's career and also impacts your pocketbook. And everyone knows that when you have to pay money, that has a much more substantial impact on your future conduct than locking you in a prison cell. NACDL's report without intent will also be covered much more in depth by another panel. But it also makes the point that we've got too much regulatory criminalization by non-elected officials, the failure to engage our committees that understand criminal policy and should have oversight over all criminal laws. And what we end up with are these terrible offenses that sometimes decades later the Supreme Court tells us were too vague and inappropriate. And we see them expanded beyond their intended limits. In a case that Jim Levine provided before Congress in his testimonies on NACDL's website, it was a woman doing her job correctly, giving the lowest bid to someone who she did not know had contributed to her employer's campaign. Jim talks about an orchid import case where the paperwork was wrong, or environmental offenses where there was just a missing shipping sticker rather than any real wrong. And what we have is Congress and regulators branding people as criminals without much thought and with substantial impact, as I mentioned earlier. Another area where we're seeing improvements is in the Racial Justice Improvement Project, where we're identifying jurisdictions that have identified that they do over-incarcerate minorities, and they're looking into it. They're requiring collection of data, studying of what it means, and why that's happening. This project requires all stakeholders, prosecution, defense, courts, and police to join together, including community stakeholders, to study and then take real action to solve the problem. So I'm looking forward to see that change the complexion of our prison populations. And then, as mentioned earlier, the war on drugs has ended. We're seeing programs that are intended to prevent drug use and steer people away from incarceration and into really addressing the program and destigmatizing, getting rehab and treatment, which we think will help move these programs out of the criminal justice arena. Thank you for allowing me to make my comments, and I look forward to a hope that, like water against a rock, that the work that Roger recounted will lead to intelligent, enlightened, appropriate, and deliberate management of our social ills.
Thank you, Cynthia.